Spaceships, rockets, science. Rocket science is hard. In your average space game, usually one of two things happens. Either you point your ship in the direction you want to go, and it goes. I'm thinking something like EVE Online or No Man's Sky. The other thing that might happen is you don't even have to point it in a direction, you just press a button and it just ends up wherever you're aiming. I'm thinking Astroneer or Mass Effect. This is nowhere near that simple. Kerbal Space Program is first and foremost a simulator, meaning it tries to get as close to the real thing as possible while staring at a TV screen and costing you less than 20 quid. Like many simulators, the idea is essentially just to mess around. Though before you try messing around, you absolutely should play the tutorials first. Because as much as you might want to just point the rocket at the sky and light the touch paper, you're going to have to learn actual rocket science to do it properly. To the tutorials then. The first 6 tutorials cover building and launching. First, a basic rocket that shoots into the sky. Then an intermediate rocket that performs a suborbital flight. Finally, the advanced rocket that is capable of achieving a stable orbit. And I did run into the occasional issue. The tutorials can be a bit bloody-minded sometimes. Tutorial 1, despite the fact that it's the first, doesn't tell you how to bring up the cursor. It just tells you to place a solid booster. I somehow managed to fuck up this simple act one step before the tutorial would have told me how to bring up the cursor. In other words, I didn't know how to unfuck my fuck up. I just kept on placing boosters all over the screen for 20 minutes, not knowing how to remove them. By the way, it's L3. L3 switches between menu and cursor mode. The other issue pops up in tutorials 4 and 6. Well, actually it doesn't become an issue until you try building and flying all by yourself in career mode. The problem is the game gives you a waypoint to steer by to assist you in the tutorials, and you can use the autopilot to fly that course without any input from you at all. But when it comes to flying your own ship later, not only will you not have that 5-star pilot that can steer by waypoints automatically, you won't have the waypoint itself at all. In other words, once you start flying in career mode all by yourself, you have to learn how to fly properly. It ain't easy. The orbit tutorial is straightforward, as long as you don't mind terms like prograde, retrograde, normal, anti-normal, inward, outward, apoapsis, periapsis, rocket science. Then there's the basics of research, which amounts to some reading and a button press. Then things start getting complicated. It's been simple up until now. The next 3 tutorials cover it does this. The next 3 tutorials cover heading towards the moon, landing on the moon, and heading back to planet Kerbal. Heading towards the moon is easy. Once you figure out you have to aim ahead of where the moon is to actually get there. Because, you know, the moon moves, obviously. Also complicating things is all the different lines on screen that show the course you set and the course you're actually on. Because gravity. Landing? Oh boy, landing. Landing is hard, since it doesn't take much impact to destroy part or the whole of your ship, or even just to tip it over. Returning to planet Kerbal isn't hard, certainly not at all if you reach the moon in the first place. It's just the same thing, but in reverse. Then there's docking. Well, what can I say about docking, except... Docking is the hardest thing you will ever do in the game. It's like landing, except you have to reach a very specific point at a very specific time to get very close to the target. Then you have to get even closer, because very close wasn't close enough. The only reliable way of catching another ship in orbit is by using something called a Hoffman transfer. Rocket science! Let's say we have a planet. Now let's say our ship is in orbit around that planet. Now let's say we want our ship in a higher orbit than that, but presently it's in the lower one. First, we perform a prograde burn. That is to say, a burn of the engines in the direction of travel. This has the effect of raising our orbit on the opposite side of the path, which causes our ship to adopt this orbital path. We then wait until we reach the higher side of the orbit. We then fire the engine's prograde again to raise the opposite side of the orbit again. Our ship is now in a higher orbit, which is where we wanted to be in the first place. That's all well and good. But it's complicated, even further, by the fact that if you adopt the exact same orbital path as your target, by definition, you're moving at the same speed as them, which means you'll never catch them. You have to adopt their orbital path at the same time you meet them. You have to be in the same place at the same time to stand any chance of actually rendezvousing with them in orbit and docking. Rocket science! The game makes it a bit easier for you, and by a bit easier I mean possible, by sticking two orange markers on screen. The top one represents where your ship will be when you meet the target's orbit. The lower one is where the target will be at the exact same time. So the idea is to rotate and alter the maneuver node until those two orange markers line up with each other, and then you'll actually meet the target. Perform the two burns. Once you're in close, switch to RCS mode using L1 and circle. Use the RCS thrusters to place the target's icon over the prograde icon. That means you're exactly behind the target. From there, thrust directly towards it. Get within 50 meters or so. Mark the docking port as your actual target. And gently does it. Woo! I'm telling you how to do this particular maneuver because I felt that for docking, the tutorial in the game was not 100% clear, and it's the hardest maneuver you can do. You need it to be clear, and I just thought that it wasn't. It took me about an hour to work out how to do it, and then it took me another hour to do it from start to finish on a single attempt. Rocket science! Also exhausting. Mind you, after I'd finally managed it the first time, I went back and tried again. It only took me 15 minutes. It's knowing how to do it. That's the trick. There's asteroid redirection, but after the docking fiasco I thought, fuck it, I've had enough for now. And if you've made it this far, there's no reason at all not to play the actual game. Although, given the sheer length, complexity and number of tutorials you have to go through and the overwhelming amount of technical details you have to actually pay attention to, you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd already played through the campaign. There's sandbox mode, where like I said, it does this sometimes. There's sandbox mode, where everything is unlocked right from the start. Science mode, where you have to earn science points to unlock new components. And career mode, my personal favourite, where you earn science but also reputation and the cash needed to pay for your creations. Sandbox is fantastic if you want to build some of the most outlandish vehicles you could possibly imagine. They might not work, but you can build them. It's always wise to consider what you're making something for before you try to throw it all together, mishmash and everything and done, and hoping for the best. Trust me, that never works. And launch! As I said earlier, the game in the tutorials gives you a 5-star pilot and a waypoint to fly for. Now you've got to do it properly. There she blows! And down she comes. Okay, so after many failures, a few things I learned. These numbers are for delta V. Delta V literally means change in velocity. To achieve orbit, you need about 4,000. Complicating this number, though, is the fact that delta V may increase by a bit or a lot as the rocket climbs through the atmosphere, as the drag of the atmosphere and gravity has less and less of an effect on the rocket motors. As I said, the atmosphere slows you down and drags you back down to ground level, so you need to be above 70 kilometers to get above the atmosphere. You don't need to burn the engines all the way above 70. Do that and you'll end up above 200. You just need to get your apoapsis above 70 kilometers. Hit the button near the bottom left to switch to a readout that shows you how high your orbit will be. Then you'll have a much better idea of when to turn, by how much, and when to stop the engines. Again, it will be useful if the tutorial pointed this out to you instead of just giving you a bloody waypoint. And by the way, apoapsis is the highest point of your orbit, periapsis is the lowest point of your orbit. Your TWR, or thrust to weight ratio, needs to be greater than 1. If it's less than 1, you won't get off the ground. And ISP means specific impulse. That's how efficiently the engines turn fuel into thrust. The higher the better. Rocket science! Lots and lots of rocket science. And apart from the apoapsis and periapsis, which the game does tell you, everything I just rattled off The game doesn't explain it to you. You'll be staring at the screen wondering what the fuck is TWR and what's this ISP bullshit. You have to go online and consult the game's wiki site to find out what these terms mean. And what gets me is that all these terms, they actually help you. They do, if you know what they are and what they mean. Which you don't, because the game doesn't tell you. But if all that's too easy for you, for fuck's sake. But if all that's too easy for you, you can try building and flying a space plane. Yeah, trying to take off from a basic level 1 runway, it's like trying to take off from a quarry, or a farmer's field, or the road outside my house. Ain't gonna happen. And even if you do take off from a level 3 runway, whoops, forgot to add oxygen. Yeah, liquid jet engines don't come with oxygen. Liquid rocket engines come with oxidizer, so they work straight out of the box. Jet engines need a separate oxygen intake. Also, solid fuel boosters work out of the box too. You just can't turn them off once you've lit them. So much rocket science! Seriously, you need to know all this shit. You can build a rover and test it out on the Space Center grounds. Or a rocket car. Or a VTOL aircraft. And all of a sudden I have a strange urge to run the docking tutorial. It's really hard, and not just because of the manoeuvres themselves, but the sheer amount of knowledge you have to make your ships work, and work in the way you actually want them to. And a lot of that knowledge is in the game, but some of it isn't, leaving you stuck unless you're willing to consult outside sources. Space planes have no tutorials at all, which means you have to disassemble an existing one to see how it works, and even then, you're not guaranteed to get one to work. It's a whole different set of considerations from rockets. Then, you have to land the damn thing. Good luck. You will fail often, but you will learn. Hopefully. The game auto-saves the last ship you built, and autosaves whenever you change out of the space plane or the rocket hangars. So if the game crashes, which it does roughly every 2 sodding hours, you won't lose too much progress. Hopefully. And the first time you build a ship capable of reaching orbit, shooting for the moon, going round it, and slingshotting back to Kerbal, and land precisely in orbit, you'll be genuinely pleased with yourself. So the next time someone says to you, it's not rocket science, you can say, I know. That I can fucking do.